Hello everyone, my name is Dinara Bowers and I am an elementary Russian language teacher, and today we will be talking about learning targets for student motivation and performance. So to help you understand the power of learning targets to heighten student motivation and give students the opportunity to take responsibility of their learning, we will focus on the following statements today. I can tell you what learning targets are, I can tell you why learning targets are important, and I can tell you how to write good learning targets and how to use them to guide instruction. Let's first take a look at the Teacher Effectiveness for Language Learning, or the TEL project. Under the language experience domain, under the second criteria, it states that effective language teachers use the daily performance objectives to capture students' energy and commitment. Under the third criteria of the learning experience domain, it also states that foreign language teachers share the sequence of learning experiences with the students. And under the planning domain, under the sixth criteria, it says that effective teachers use the backward design process to plan lessons that lead students to meet the unit performance objectives. So today we will examine the learning targets and what they are. We will talk about the importance of these learning targets. Then we will talk about the characteristics of good learning targets as well as how to write an excellent learning target. We will talk about the learning targets and how they affect our instruction. Once we have the learning targets, we will talk the logistics of the learning targets. What do you do with them? Where do you post them? How do you manage that process? And then we will talk about the learning targets within the lesson itself. At the end of the session, we will check for objectives. So what is a learning target? Learning targets are the statements of the intended learning based on the standards. We definitely want to make sure that our learning targets are referencing our standards. We want to make sure that they are intended learning that is based on them. That's something we want our students to accomplish, and that they're closely connected to what the students are learning. Learning targets are usually in a child-friendly language, and they're specific to the lesson for the day and are directly connected to the assessment. Some of the similar terms that our colleagues use are can-do statements or I can statements, students will or I will statements, as well as we refer to them as objectives. According to Brookhart, a learning target helps students grasp the lesson's purpose, why it is crucial to learn this chunk of information on this day and in this way. Let's first examine the types of learning targets. In the district that I'm currently teaching at, we have annual proficiency goals for every year and every level that the teachers are teaching the curriculum to. We want to make sure that our students walk away with meaningful language that they can speak to their peers, to their teachers, as well as to the strangers who speak the language. So based on our annual proficiency goals, we work closely with our team to create our curriculum. We create the curriculum based on the thematic units in our district, and we do not use any kind of textbooks. So our unit learning targets directly reflect the annual proficiency goals that we would like our students to reach. Once we have our unit learning targets, we carefully unpack them into daily learning targets so that our daily learning targets are specific enough for our students to master. So each time students perform on a daily basis, it adds on to them mastering their unit learning targets, and these performances will add on to their overall annual proficiency. So why is it important to have learning targets in your lesson? Well, first of all, we said they are directly connected to the standards, so we want to make sure that they address what our students will be able to do. They are directly tied into the curriculum because, again, we want to make sure that our learning targets directly reflect the content that we are teaching our students. And they're closely connected to the proficiency goals because ultimately we want our students to be able to speak the language, and the performances in their daily learning targets add on to their overall proficiency. It is definitely important for the teacher effectiveness measure because there's so many districts nowadays that use teacher effectiveness programs in order to evaluate their teachers. And it is extremely important for the mastery because we want our students to walk away each single day feeling successful, that they have mastered the learning targets and feeling that they can do it, they can take on this world. But ultimately, who is it important for? Who are the learning targets important for? Yes, that's right. They're important for the students. So why using learning targets? Well, according to Black and William, students need to know what they're expected to learn, not just what they've learned. So it is important to show students where they can get and how they can get there. It also helps students develop a picture of what is expected of them to learn. So they are definitely aware of those expectations and they know what they need to be working towards. Now, a lot of students are used to receiving a sequence of activities with no overarching rationale, and you definitely don't want to have students wondering, where are you going with all this? I can definitely tell you that there were classes, and when I went to school, there were classes in my college where I would sit there and think, why is my teacher or why is my professor telling me all this? Why are we doing this activity? Why are we reading this book? What is this ultimately going to lead me to? And when students acquire such an overview, they become more committed and effective as a learner. So if students are aware of what is being expected of them, if students know exactly what they're learning and how the successful implementation of the learning target looks like, they become a lot more committed and they become a lot more effective as learners. Actually, according to Marzano's research, students who can identify what they're learning significantly outscore those students who cannot. And when I was researching this, I found out that the percentage by which students outscore is quite a tremendous difference. Students who know the learning targets, students who are committed to the learning targets and expectations, outscore those students who don't know what the learning targets are by 20%, which is quite a significant amount. Learning targets do not have inherent power, and I think that's extremely important to know because they have to be referenced to consistently every single day. So if for some reason teachers reference it to it one day but not the other, or reference it for 2 consistent days and then don't reference to it at all, then unfortunately they do not have that inherent power and they need to be shared with the students intentionally on a day-to-day basis. So let's talk about the organization of the learning targets. We already talked in our previous slides about the types of learning targets. We definitely set our annual proficiency goals first, which is something that we want our students to accomplish. Then we set up unit learning targets, and then we set up our daily learning targets, which our performances are based on. Once we have our daily learning targets, we need to organize them so that they are reflecting the modes of communication that we have. So, our learning targets usually are divided into interpretive targets, presentational learning targets, and interpersonal learning targets. So, let's take a look at the curriculum document that we are currently using at the school that I'm teaching at and just at the district overall. Our annual target for our students is novice high at this particular level, and we want our students to master these unit learning targets. As you can see, they are divided by 3 modes of communication. So let's take a look and read just a few examples of interpretive, interpersonal, and presentational learning targets. So some of the examples of interpretive learning targets would be: I can understand a weather report. I can select the correct clothes to wear based on the weather. Let's say students listen to a passage and then they select the clothes to wear based on the passage they hear about different types of weather. Some of the examples of interpersonal can-do statements can be: I can ask and tell you which clothes I wear for different types of weather and why. I can ask you what you like to do and tell you what I like to do during each season. And some of the examples of the presentational can-do statements are: I can present a weather report, or I can describe my perfect day based on the weather, including what I do and what I wear. So now that we have our unit learning targets, we know exactly what we want our students to be able to do within that unit, within that semester. What makes a good learning target? And let's examine that together. So, well, first of all, they're connected to the standards and curriculum based. We already talked about that. They are appropriate for the proficiency level. Well, if you want your students to reach a novice high proficiency level, you definitely want to make sure that your learning target reflects that level. You don't want your learning target to sound like an intermediate level target, because your students are not able to do that yet, so that target would be too high for them. You also don't want that target to be too easy, because your students now are performing at a higher level and you want to make sure you're challenging them. You want to make sure that you can measure your learning target so that you know exactly what the performance looks like. And also you want to make sure that those learning targets have instructional activities lined up in your lesson that directly reflect the attainment of the learning target. Your learning targets have to be very specific. There should not be no room for misunderstanding. They have to demonstrate what students will be able to do. So you have to show exactly what's expected of them and what you want your students to master. And you definitely want to make sure that they are in a child-friendly language, especially if you're teaching elementary children. You want to make sure that you're not using any big words that they're unfamiliar with. You definitely want your students to know exactly what you want them to master by the end of the lesson. So this over here is an example of some of the ineffective learning targets. And the reason why these targets are ineffective is because they are too broad, or maybe they're missing information. They might not be very specific. They might not reference the standards or curriculum. These learning targets are taken from different languages and as well as the disciplines. So there might be a math can-do statement or a reading can-do statements. So if you would like, examine these, and if you have a peer or colleague, discuss with your peer or colleague why do you think that these learning targets are ineffective. This second part of the learning targets, these are the learning targets that are a lot more specific. So these are the learning targets that reflect the curriculum more, and these are the learning targets that you might want to use for your lesson. One of the resources that I would like to share with you at this point is a list of global statements on the actful.org website and the American Council for Foreign Language Teaching and Learning. And these are the global statements that are divided by the proficiency levels. So if for some reason you do not have a curriculum in the district and you're using a textbook, you can definitely refer to those can-do statements. By no means are these can-do statements an exhaustive list. It is definitely something that you can use as a reference. However, they give a pretty good understanding of what the learning targets should look like at each level, as well as they're divided by the types of types of learning targets, and they're organized by the modes of communication, which can be very helpful. So again, if you haven't seen that, so please feel free to take a look, and hopefully this will be a useful resource for you. So now let's practice together. So let's take one of the learning targets from the unit that we are using. Since we already have those unit learning targets, we will focus on those. Our specific unit learning target for this unit is I can ask and tell you what clothes I wear for different types of weather and why. So let's take a look at this specific unit learning target, and let's try to unpack it together for the specific daily learning targets. So one of the first learning targets that I have listed on here, I have already unpacked it for you, is I can identify and or name different types of weather. Taking into consideration that our students' level of proficiency is a novice level of proficiency, I would like to start with my students first, naming different types of weather, and then they're going to learn how to name different clothes because they haven't learned that vocabulary yet and they don't have that information. So once they know how to say what the weather is like, as well as how to name different pieces of clothing, then students will be able to practice the language chunk. So the next learning target is I can tell you what clothes I wear. So here your students would probably be saying, I wear shorts, or I wear pants, or I wear a dress. The next lesson learning target would focus on I can tell you what clothes I wear for different types of weather. So here we'll combine the information from the previous lessons connected to the previous knowledge, and now we want our students to be able to say what clothes they wear for different types of weather. Then we're going to take it a little bit further, and here students will be able to tell us what clothes they wear for different types of weather and why. Okay, so here probably would be I wear shorts because it's hot, or I wear pants because it's cold outside. Okay? Once students are able to say that in a sentence, I would add in another learning target, and this time our students will be able to ask what clothes someone wears for different types of weather and why. So here we will work on the question. And ultimately they will be able to reach the specific unit learning target. I can ask and tell you what clothes you wear for different types of weather and why. So if I decided to make that unit can do my daily learning target, then that would definitely not work out well for my students because they would not have the vocabulary and they wouldn't have enough time to practice this because all this information is new for them. So they probably would feel extremely overwhelmed and would not be able to perform my unit learning target. So it is extremely important to make sure you know where your students are at, what level of proficiency they are currently at, and what level you would like them to be. So this way you can gauge whether your learning targets are targeting the level that your students are at and would like to be. So let's touch base real fast on what we're learning today. So, well, first of all, we are learning what the learning targets are, and we already discussed what the learning targets are, and we went over some of the definitions based on the research. Then we talked about the importance of learning targets and how they're extremely important for the students. At the end of the day, we don't want our students to be wondering where we are going with all of this. And the next thing that we're moving on to today is I can tell you how to write good learning targets and how to use them to guide instruction. We already discussed some characteristics and criteria for good learning targets. Now we will focus on the next part of our learning target for today is how to use our learning targets to guide instruction. So now you have your learning target. You have written your learning target in a very specific language. You're pretty sure that it is child-friendly, it relates directly to your standards curriculum, as well as reflects the performance level that you want your students to be at. And you know exactly that this learning target will help them achieve their annual proficiency goals, and that it is realistic enough for them to master within your lesson time frame. So now, how do they guide your instruction? What do you do with them? Where do you physically put them? And when do you introduce and refer to them? Well, ultimately, if you would look at the learning target picture, you will see that the middle of the learning target is where you want your students to be able to master it. You want them to be able to put that arrow straight into that learning target. You want them to be able to master that specific language chunk or that specific question you're practicing for the day. And the arrow is what becomes your instruction. That's something that has to go for your target in order to help them achieve that. So let's examine this question step by step. First of all, how do learning targets guide your instruction? Well, what language do you use? First of all, when you refer to the learning target, I personally speak to my students during my language class time 90% or more in the target language. However, when I mention my learning targets to the students, I always say them in the English language because my students are at a novice high proficiency level and they're novice speakers, and there might be some intermediate ones. However, they're still not able to understand the learning targets in Russian language. So I use my learning targets in English because I want my students to be able to know exactly what's expected of them. However, I know some teachers whose students are advanced levels, and at that point, if you feel that your students understand exactly what's expected of them, then I would say definitely use those learning targets in the language you're teaching. I also know some other teachers who use their learning targets in both languages. So they first state them in English and then show their students what they would look like in the target language. So now, what activities do you do for these learning targets? Well, when you are sitting there and you're lesson planning and you're coming up with activities, it's very important to make sure that you are specifically referencing the learning targets. Let me give you an example to make it more clear. Let's say our learning target is, I can tell you what animals I like. And then you sit down there and you think about the activities, and that happened to me a lot of times before. I would get so creative and I would come up with a great activity and I would start planning it out, and all of a sudden I would realize, oh, wait a minute, that's a great activity. But are my students actually saying what animals they like in this specific activity? And then realize, oh no, they're telling me what animals live in the zoo. But that's not what my learning target was. So then I think, oh, what a great activity, and I'll just write it down in the parking lot. So then I can use it later on for my purposes of teaching. And then I have to go back and try to analyze what exactly is my learning target. So I want my students to be able to say at the end of the lesson what animals they like. So then I try to come up with an activity that specifically targets the objective for the day. So now you have written your learning targets, you have activities that are aligned with your learning targets, you know exactly what you want your students to achieve, and you know how you are going to do it. So what do you do with it? Well, there are two different types of teachers. Some of the teachers are fortunate enough to have their own classroom, and some of the teachers don't have their own classroom, and they are teaching on a cart. I'm one of those teachers, and I jokingly always say that I'm teaching on a cart, thus I'm an a la carte teacher. What can you do? Well, first of all, you can use dry erase boards. So you can see an example of a dry erase board here on the PowerPoint. So it's just a little dry erase board that a colleague of mine uses, and it's very easy to erase, and then you can fill it in every single day. If you have a lot of different classes and a lot of different preps, you can also use a paper agenda, which is right over here, and it's like a chart tablet paper, and you can write down your objectives and your learning targets for the day as well as your agenda for the whole week. So this way, all you have to do is just flip the pages, and then each lesson will follow the objectives. So if for some reason you have classes that are on different lessons, it's very easy for you just to flip your agenda and get to the learning objective that you need for that day. Right here on the right, you would see a picture of a card, my teaching card that I have in my classroom. And what I do is I have a dry erase sheet. It's a really thin dry erase sheet that I laminated myself. And I use really strong magnets to hang it on my card, and I also fill it out with objectives and agenda at the end of each day or at the end of each week. I have a few of them actually. And then all I need to do is I just need to switch it out. And I take off the one I don't need and put the one that I need up for the day. Okay? You can also have it in a PowerPoint presentation. So if you use PowerPoint presentation for your students a lot, you can include your objectives and agenda in the PowerPoint, and that can be very helpful as well, as it references directly on the slides what you are talking about and what is your learning target for the day. So now that you have your learning targets, you have written them out, they're posted on your board, they're in your PowerPoint presentation, how do you introduce them and how do you refer to them throughout the lesson? Well, first, definitely it's very important to make sure that you state your objective or learning targets in the beginning of the lesson. Okay, so students need to know not only what they're learning but also what they're going to be doing for the day, and it's very important. Why it is important is because some students might have favorite activities that they're looking forward to and would like to do. And I, for example, have this train activity where students pretend that they get on the train, and my younger classes just absolutely love this activity. So when I go through my agenda, they get so excited. They say, okay, we got to do a really good job because we really got to make sure we get to that train activity. So they get really excited about it. So next thing, it's really important when you tell them about the can-do statements, create a hook. Make it very interesting for them. Explain to them why it is important for them to learn that specific can-do statement. Why is it important for them to be able to say that? You can connect it to the real life situation. One of the examples that I use with my students is a real life situation that happened to me. And I told my students about it, and they were super excited. So our learning target for the day was, I can tell you where community places are located. And I noticed that some of the students were sighing deeply and saying, oh, why are we learning this? So I told them a story. I told them that I don't only speak Russian, I also speak a little bit of Spanish. And one day when I was coming out of the restaurant, I've noticed that there was a young man in a panic looking for someone who speaks Spanish. So I offered him my help, and I told them that I had to explain this young man how to get to the hospital because his wife was in the car and she was choking on something, so he had to take her to the hospital right away. And I had to explain to him in Spanish how to get to the hospital, how many blocks he had to drive and where he had to turn so he could take her to the hospital. It had such a profound effect on a lot of my students that they till nowadays remember and tell me about this story. They say it's important to learn the language because what happens if you need to tell someone how to get to the hospital and you can't? So students must not only see, hear, they must also be able to share the objectives. So make sure that you include a partner activity where your students turn around to each other and then they share the objectives with each other. You want them to really know what you would like them to master by the end of the lesson. You want to make sure that they are connected to the previous and future knowledge. And as well, it's very important to make sure that you mention what assessment you will be using, how the students will be assessed on the mastery of their objectives, and again, what kind of activities you will use within the lesson. Then you can also reference your can-do statements or your learning targets in the middle of the lesson. So first of all, it's very important to make sure that students are on track and are not somewhere in their happy land in their head. It's also important to make sure that there's no misunderstanding so that students exactly understand what's expected of them. And if there is some misunderstanding, it's a great time to correct that misunderstanding and put your students back on track. And of course, you will definitely check for your objectives or your learning targets at the end of the lesson. First of all, it's important to have some kind of a performance assessment, formal or informal, where your students are showing you that they were able to master the performance objective. This way, you can use that feedback to help you guide instruction. And another way to get feedback is to check for understanding. You can also have your students do some kind of a self-assessment and see how many students were able to master the objective, how many students feel comfortable with it, how many students might need more time to practice it, and some students may be struggling. So definitely use that feedback to help you guide your future instruction. So now let's check for understanding. So hopefully at the end of the session you are able now to tell what learning targets are, why learning targets are important, and how to write good learning targets and how to use them to guide instruction. Thank you so much for listening to the session, and if you have any questions and comments, please feel free to email me at dinarabowers@gmail.com.